Born in Tipton, Missouri in 1944, Harold Eugene Clark was the third of 13 children in a family of mixed European and Native American heritage. He started writing songs at a young age, was a player in the early 60s folk music scene before becoming an original member of the Byrds. Now, the Byrds were the closest thing the Americans had to the Beatles in 1964, but unlike the Beatles, who had played together for many, many years before anyone had even heard of them, the Byrds were mostly thrown together by producers and were therefore not exactly road-tested. As a result, their rhythm section was pretty poor. Drummer Michael Clark, in particular, was asked to join the band primarily for his good looks over his technical proficiency. If you've heard early recordings of the Byrds, you get a pretty good idea of how rough and ready bands of this era really were. It's basically garage music, and the barrier to entry was pretty low. This is at least part of the reason why LA bands were looked down upon in the 60s, particularly by their counterparts in San Francisco, Buffalo Springfield being a notable exception. What was, of course, most important from an industry perspective was that the Byrds looked the part, and they certainly did. And at least had good voices, because the industry standard at the time was for session musicians like the Wrecking Crew to play the backing tracks on pop records, while the stars themselves put mere sprinkles on top in the form of vocals. But at the very least, the Byrds also got to add Roger McGuinn's distinctive Rickenbacker 12-string guitar, as well as having two particularly strong vocalists in Gene Clark and David Crosby. Now, one thing that I've never heard a decent explanation for, however, is why the producers behind the Byrds had such a preference for Roger McGuinn's fairly weak and reedy voice over Clark's or even Crosby's. In any event, their lineup on record differed dramatically to how they presented themselves on stage as a band. Now, David Crosby's enormous ego and Hollywood brat energy is the stuff of legend. Given his high opinion of himself, he initially tried to be the standalone frontman for the Byrds, and his chubby Jagger bit saw him getting laughed off stage pretty quickly, only for him then to decide that he, rather than Gene Clark, needed to be the Byrds' main rhythm guitarist. As a result, Gene Clark became the standalone lead singer, or at least the main visual focus of the Byrds as a live group. This is just as well as he was strikingly good-looking and certainly a favourite with the ladies. I'd like to break here quickly to point out how much I don't like CSNY, and that it's remarkable in my view that David Crosby had the career that he had, considering he was so difficult to work with, and ultimately he's written only 3 or 4 songs in his life that anyone can really name. He does, of course, have a great voice. At the time, Gene Clark was indeed the only member of the Byrds to come forward with any of his own material, which, as is a common story among groups at the time, caused the other members of the Byrds to become extremely jealous of all the sweet, sweet money that songwriting royalties were bringing in for him. The other members didn't receive these kinds of royalties because outside of Gene Clark's songs, they typically played other people's, most notably Bob Dylan's. Again, this approach harkens back to the pre-Beatles era of showbiz, where performers were rarely expected to write their own material. Gene Clark wrote a few of their earlier hits that weren't simply Bob Dylan covers, but a combination of the jealousy from the other members of the band and Gene Clark's own fear of flying saw him getting pushed out of the Byrds relatively early, with Crosby famously describing him as the bird who couldn't fly. He came back to the band several times for short stints in the following years, but his usual demons got the better of him, and the Byrds story largely carried on Clarkless, although not literally. Byrds nerds will appreciate that joke, as not only did they start with 2 guys with the surname Clark, they went on to have 2 guys named Gene, as well as 2 guys with Parsons as a surname. What are the chances? So anyway, because he clearly had the makings of a star, Gene Clark was pushed into making his very first solo record in 1967. It's an excellent psych record with bits of early crossover country and featuring Wrecking Crew players including Glenn Campbell, Leon Russell, and of course Clarence White, who famously later became a member of the Byrds himself and is probably my favourite guitarist ever. I Found You is as good an example as any from this album. A great tune with its funky seventh chords and the kind of sound that you perhaps weren't likely to hear from Gene Clark later on in his career when he went far more in a country direction. Well, I knew at the moment when I saw you, I could feel you close to me across the room. Last night, alright, I found you. There are three main problems with Gene Clark's first solo album, and they have nothing to do with the music. Firstly, it was released at the same time as the Byrds' Younger Than Yesterday, obviously his biggest competitor in the market for Byrdsy music. Secondly, it was credited to Gene Clark and the Godson brothers rather than just Gene Clark, a branding error he would repeat on his next two albums. And thirdly, he failed to back it up with significant touring or otherwise keeping himself in the public eye either before or after its release. Now, the first two of those criticisms can be reasonably attributed to naivety, as after all, the music industry on an operational level was fundamentally run by kids in their perhaps early 20s, for whom the kind of concepts around release strategies and branding that we're familiar with today simply didn't exist. These kind of branding errors are so much more noticeable now in the Spotify era. You'll notice for people like Paul McCartney on Spotify, his listening figures for Wings songs that also appear on his solo artist profile as Paul McCartney have the same listener counts. Elvis Costello, on the other hand, exists entirely separately from Elvis Costello in the attractions on Spotify. So you go looking for Oliver's Army on Elvis Costello's profile and it's not there. Madness. More importantly, the commercial failure of Gene Clark's first solo album and most of his subsequent career opens up an interesting conversation about self-sabotage, unrealized potential, and sheer bad luck. Alex Chilton is probably a good example of an artist whose career started with a bang at an early age in the 1960s, after which for the rest of his life he was more or less searching for a way to kind of replicate that success, but never really quite got there. Mostly in his case, down to bad luck, and later on substance abuse and a failure of, or even an active disdain for, commercial considerations whatsoever. Gene Clark had all of these problems in 1967, especially his refusal to tour, which like now, in a full circle way, has become the main money maker for musicians today, just as it was then when labels would so thoroughly rip artists off. So even if the Beatles were inventing the standalone album around this time in the form of Sgt. Pepper's, they could only do that without touring because they were the biggest band in the world. And Gene Clark, like everyone else, had to continue to compete in the old world pop market, which was still mostly about shifting singles off the back of personal appearances. Now, speaking to this theme, I'm in the habit of describing myself as a failed musician. People usually respond to this quite sympathetically and often say things about life being a journey and you're never a failure if you're still chasing the dream or whatever it is. But I think that kind of misses the point of what I'm trying to get across there. For one, I think that accepting failure in one way or another is a really important part of being an adult, of being a human being, and also that there's a good argument that the kind of person who chases material or creative fulfillment through music are basically just giant children who crave the approval of others, trying to fill some kind of hole in their soul. And sure, I'm absolutely one of these people too. But if you're driven by these things, success, in whatever form you might imagine it to be, is really never going to be enough for you anyway. This is why Kurt Cobain decided to redecorate his greenhouse with his brains. So while Gene Clark's legacy includes, in my view, one of the most heartbreakingly gorgeous albums ever recorded, it was the failure and disappointment within his lifetime that drove him into a life of substance abuse and ultimately an early grave. Does that make him, as an artist, a failure? Surely not. After all, Van Gogh never sold a painting in his life. Second to that, neither I nor you are likely to create any kind of masterpiece that will stand the test of time, and that's just fine. I think the pursuit of that is a worthy and beautiful thing, but I also politically view the concept of fame and success as a very post-war 20th century liberal conceit, where each and every person has it drilled into them from an early age that they are special snowflakes and that the world needs to know their innermost thoughts, feelings, and creative utterances. Do you think Chinese peasants lie awake at night thinking about how many YouTube views they're getting? I don't like generational warfare, but in a sense, I think the boomer generation created a monster in individualism that started out as, well, you're a good singer, you should be on the telly, and ended up as, well, you don't have any talent or insight, but you should be famous anyway, which is what drives so much of our online culture today. And I say this as someone who once upon a time would have quite liked to be famous and successful as a musician, but I can see now, in hindsight, there is no way I would have been emotionally equipped to handle the reality of that. And most people should, at least, feel the same way. Fame is not a normal state of being. Now, I was a child prodigy, if such a thing really exists. And I grew up having people telling me every day that I was going to be something. I think this attitude can be really damaging, because what successful musicians or successful people in any field will not tell you, or in fact what they can't even see themselves, is the amount of luck that goes into a successful career of any kind. And not only was I not particularly lucky myself, I'm still, in hindsight, able to accept that perhaps I was simply not good enough. Not to say good enough at playing music, but more so not good enough at recognizing and finding a place for my talents to exist within the culture, the time and place in which I lived. Knowing what I know now, if I could do it all over again, I would have maybe spent more time learning about branding and marketing than I spent learning how to do this. Or whatever. But this has always been the case in music, and the experience of 99% of creative people. The Coen brothers film Inside Llewyn Davis is the perfect exploration of this very idea, put in the context of the early 1960s East Coast folk scene, not entirely unlike the one that Gene Clark sprung from. So Gene Clark was just like anyone else, another person who wasn't quite good or lucky or savvy enough to break through as a household name like so many of his peers within that particular scene managed to do. He nonetheless continued to make great records, in 1968 teaming up with bluegrass banjo player Doug Dillard for two excellent and influential records under the name Dillard and Clark, again repeating the mistake of not putting it out under his own name. The first of these records is considered up there with the Byrds' Sweetheart of the Rodeo and the adjacent International Submarine Band for pioneering the genre of country rock in 1968, and it is really good. The second one, the following year, contains two of my favourites in a gorgeous cover of Don't Let Me Down by the Beatles and Polly. Polly is the other track on the second Dillard and Clark album that really pulls at my heartstrings. In fact, there's a video of the Black Crowes playing some festival covering this song, and in between verses the keyboard player is wiping away the tears. It's so moving. If the wild bird could speak, he'd tell of all the places it's been. Now, I am trying to imitate his vocal style as best that I can, and a big part of that is the use of tremolo, the subtle variation in volume rather than pitch, which is what vibrato is. This is made more complicated by the fact that the terms are so often used interchangeably, especially in the wide world of guitar effects, pedals, and so on. So we are used to hearing singers use vibrato often to an extreme because it sounds quite good, but it's in fact easier to do. Scott Walker is one of my favourite singers of all time, but purists would say that his excellent vibrato is actually his weakness as a singer. Jeff Buckley and Tom York and the guy from Muse in the modern era have taken this to a kind of extreme, and as much as I like those singers, I think it's actually quite showy and unnecessary most of the time. To my ears, what Gene Clark is doing with tremolo is much harder to do and is a more of a pure technique. What he's doing is very subtle in that his singing style is largely free of embellishment or theatrics, something which puts him, to my mind, in the same class as your John Lennons or Alex Chiltons, singing straight from the heart. I was also surprised to learn, via the good people at Wikipedia, that Gene Clark has at least some Native American ancestry, and at the risk of fetishizing this aspect of his character and doing a racism, I can see the argument that this comes across both in his appearance and in the kind of haunted quality his voice has, in combination with the sort of big picture wisdom found in his lyrics. A couple more records followed. Roadmaster is a bit of a damp squib, but White Light in 1971 is a really nice, if overly sullen, country record. He teamed up on that one with Native American guitarist Jesse Ed Davis, a really important figure in the 1970s studio scene, who is also all over No Other. The Virgin is my favorite on this album, but for a Spanish guitar and his cover of Tears of Rage are considered iconic. Now at this point, the poisonous spectre of Sir David of Crosby appears once again for the Byrds 1972 reunion album, which is not as bad as people like to say, nor is it really very good. Gene Clark's contributions are indeed the best thing on it. Following this, he signed to David Geffen's Asylum Records, teaming up with producer Thomas Jefferson Kay for 1974's No Other. So that's the end of Gene Clark's No Other. And my hot take on this record is that it is streets ahead of anything anyone in the wider Byrds universe ever released. Of course, I include the Byrds there, every member of the Byrds in their solo albums, Flying Burrito Brothers, and Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I'm not going to include Young because while I think he overlaps somewhat with Byrds, he is over here in his own orbit anyway. And despite that, Gene Clark is the individual most overlooked and basically forgotten in the whole country rock story. Indeed, No Other completely tanked on release. Asylum Records were furious that it cost so much money to make and yet yielded no commercial singles whatsoever. Sadly, they went on to delete the album from their catalogue a mere 2 years later. The Art Deco cover art hinting at the grandeur of the music inside, and of course features Gene Clark in an androgynous gown on the back as well, something that would no doubt infuriate puritanical, conservative-minded country and rock fans. Gene Clark never truly recovered from its failure. It took him 3 years to follow it up with 1977's Two Sides to Every Story, again produced by Thomas Jefferson Kay, but in a far more subdued fashion. In the subsequent years, he veered between various collaborations, sometimes with various ex-Byrds members. He enjoyed something of a commercial hit with the duets album So Rebellious a Lover in 1987 with Carla Olson, but the writing was on the wall for him health-wise, particularly as short periods of commercial success were typically followed by long periods of substance abuse for Gene Clark. And shortly after reuniting with the Byrds for their 1991 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, Gene Clark passed away in 1991 at the age of 46, the result of some combination of heart disease, throat cancer, and a bleeding ulcer. He was fittingly buried under the epitaph, No Other. If you liked this video, please do me a favor and hit the like button, but if you didn't, rather than hit the dislike button, can I suggest you leave a comment and let me know why? I'm always open to feedback, advice, and opinions that challenge mine. Plus, it apparently helps me game YouTube's algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it will let you know whenever I put something new up. You can follow me on all the socials if you're so inclined. And if you'd like to incentivize me with a $5 a month to continue doing these videos, a link to my Patreon should be just beneath this video. Cheers.